Good morning, Daniel.
Top of the morning, Dan.
What are you, Irish?
Today I am, I guess.
Today, six or so months, 5 or so months away from St. Patrick's Day. Suddenly, the jig has caught you.
It's getting cold outside. It's almost Guinness season.
It's always Guinness season, Daniel. There's never been a day ending in Y that wasn't a good day for a Guinness. Anyway, what are we talking about today?
I want to talk about DIY or do it yourself financial planning, good fit candidates to work with us, and how to build trust with clients.
Welcome to the Science of Wealth, where we discuss the science behind financial planning and the art of learning and applying it. That's an interesting conversation. I mean, as I like to joke, DIY clients are not a good fit to work with us. Everybody else is a good fit to work with us, and I think we've talked about trust before. Do we have a mistrust problem going on at the moment?
I don't believe so. I do think it's one of those things that's probably worth just discussing again, as it's one of the most important things that, builds a client relationship.
Sure, makes sense. All right, well then, I guess let's talk about the people who would never trust us, or if they did trust us, it probably is not the right kind of trust. The DIY people.
I think it's self-explanatory, right? DIY, do it yourself. But can you actually just talk about what the client profile of a DIYer looks like?
I think there's kind of two broad, and when I say broad, I mean like really broad categories for DIY folks. There are people who are doing it themselves despite a lack of awareness, knowledge, or capability. These are just people sort of who manage their own finances, but manage might be a generous word, right? There's really just nobody else involved in their finances, and so they are doing better or worse in the context then that they are good or bad at self managing, whatever that might mean for them in their personal financial capacity. And then the second group are, very devout DIY people who are big, bogleheads or who are, into reading personal finance blog or have gone through financial coaching or financial education or who are personally fascinated by finance. Like I think of my last landlord, Gus, who was an engineer who went and got a master's in finance at some point in his life just because he was fascinated by it. And I think that dude was 100% on top of his own finances.
All right, that's interesting. You said 100% on top of the finances. When I think DIYers, my mind just goes to, low cost ETFs or investment management and doing that themselves. Would this gentleman, Gus, be doing everything else from insurance to estate planning himself as well, or is that the norm?
I think he was probably more on top of that investment end. I don't know about his estate situation or insurance or anything like that. If I had to guess, I think he was probably okay there, or at least had done sort of the needful. But it's not a conversation we ever got into. I don't disagree with your assessment of a DIYer as being a person who probably is not 100% on top of all those topics as a kind of question of self-efficacy, but I think they are on top of those topics, or they have sort of rationalized or disregarded certain topics as not being important to them. This is sort of the person who never buys life insurance because they're never going to die sort of mentality.
Interesting. So, investments aside, let's assume these DIYers are doing okay in that regard. What are some of the often overlooked areas that DIYers tend to neglect?
They tend to have applied sort of this one size fits all thinking to a lot of parts of their life. So they are often very rules based in terms of like, we'll use Boggleheads as an example. They'll have a two, three, or four fund portfolio. They will only save into certain types of investments, only save into certain types of accounts, only save specific percentages or ratios of their income. In terms of insurance, they will probably have done some min maxing instead of comprehensive protection, right? So as financial planners, we often are sort of telling clients to kind of turn the dial to the right and really increase their liability protection, increase their sub limits on certain specific assets and items and so on, really making sure that they are really well protected. And I think folks in the DIY category tend to sort of take a bit of a budget conscious approach to their risk management, right? They might forego uninsured motorist coverage. They might not have life or disability insurance or long term care insurance. And there can definitely be some financial benefits, right? Like you're not going to find a lot of DIYers with a whole life policy or a universal life policy. They're not going to be overpaying for that. But I think being underinsured is a fairly common item. I think they are very likely, if they have an estate plan, to have done it either off of like a PDF template on like a LegalZoom or something like that, or to have used a DIY estate platform. I don't think they'll have hired an attorney or gotten legal counsel, regardless of whether that would have been very useful or beneficial in their personal situation. And then budget wise, I think there's a bit of a cynical personality in this category of DIY, which is sort of that Oscar Wilde, a cynic is a person who knows the cost of everything and the value of nothing. So I think they tend to be very deal conscious, very penny pinchy, and not particularly self indulgent in their finances, unless they have been so financially successful as to be financially self indulgent. But I think that's kind of a subcategory of, call it like very affluent DIY versus good saver DIY.
In your experience, does DIY tend to have a range of net worth, right? Like, do we see DIYers that are worth $15 million or 10, or is there a certain point in which there simply is too much complexity and someone doesn't DIY anymore?
I think there's sort of an interesting inversion that happens here. I see a lot of reasonably successful DIYers who have maybe like $2 to $4 million. They've been really good at saving. They've been very equity heavy in their investments. They've used a lot of low cost index funds. They've been compounding from a young age. Maybe they're fire adherents. So like they tend to have done a really good job of like the sweat equity saving components of building wealth. But it's as people get kind of north of 3 million, 4 million, 5 million, or they get into 10, 15, $20 million genre, then they really end up in a barbell situation. They either are still in the DIY category, but they're not in the high efficacy version. They're in that sort of unmanaged, nobody helps me category. I think you see that in some cases where some people are maybe not very money focused, right? In the money script sense, they are not money averse or money avoidant, but they don't really think about money. Like they happen to have done well in life, but they just don't think about it that much, or like money is not really the meaning or purpose to them. Or they are full delegators, right? They hit a certain level of net worth where they're like, I'm an incredible surgeon, I'm a great entrepreneur, I'm a great lawyer, whatever they do. And they figured out a long time ago that their time and energy is best spent on what they are incredible at, not what they're smart enough to figure out. And so they spend all their time on what they're incredible at, and they have that accountant, that lawyer, that financial planner, and so on to just handle all those things for them.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think for even a stout DIYer at a certain point, there just becomes enough complexity. Everybody has a breaking point or where it becomes overwhelming or too complex. Do you see, for the average DIYer, this translates into other areas of their life as well when seeking professional advice? Like, is a DIYer less inclined to go to the doctor or seek advice in other areas as well?
I like to say that a lot of DIYers in the category we're talking about sort of fulfill a role of Schrodinger's asshole, which is to say they are simultaneously willing to accept help in cases that they need it. And also simultaneously, they didn't need that help in the first place, and it was always their idea, and you didn't provide me with any value. So, like, what we'll see in this personality is like they will say in a very logical, rational, conversational way, like, well, of course, if I really needed help with that thing, medicine, tax, law, whatever, of course I would hire the professionals. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not a tax professional. I'm not a doctor. And then as soon as they've gotten the help or the professional perspective, it's remarkable to watch their incredible powers of hindsight become powers of foresight, in which they'll be like, well, of course, I had the idea about those Roth conversions. I had the idea about that trust. I had the idea of doing this course of treatment, or like whatever the thing is. They essentially sort of absorb credit for the things that the professionals do for them and rationalize to themselves that they always knew that in the first place, or already had 95% of it there in the first place. And the professional wasn't that much help anyway. So there's simultaneously willing to accept help, and also help has never been useful to them.
The absorption of credit is an interesting one, not only in a professional context, but also, friends, family, and whatnot. Uh, is that why, in your experience, DIYers tend to not be a great fit to work with us?
Yeah, I mean, and we've worked with many DIYers over the years, and it's interesting because I like to say we have sort of two groups of them. We have 4 or 5 people that I would today still call DIYers, but they came to us originally on a very forthright premise. They were like, "Hey, I am good at what I do. I've made a lot of money. I've saved a lot of money. I'm a little skeptical of the value proposition, but I don't know what I don't know, and so I'm willing to engage a professional." But I want to be very clear up front. I'm not going to move forward past the first year, past the initial engagement. I'm not going to have you manage money for me. And when the time is up, the time is up. And the funny thing is, the people who are super forthright about that, I think we're batting 1,000 on those people staying clients. It's the people who sort of pretend that they have an interest in a long-term relationship who really don't, that tend to then kind of come and go, or tend to be really difficult to work with and not be a great fit. The funny thing about that subcategory of 4 or 5 clients who fit into that category is they're some of my favorite clients today, because they've sort of come around on the value of it. That doesn't mean that they're now letting us manage money or something, but they're very fun to work with and talk to. We even actually just talked to one recently who asked the question, right? Like, am I a good fit for you? And I just pointedly said, like, look, I'll be honest, I just like you. Like, you're not hard to work with. I enjoy talking to you. You both are fun, enjoyable people. So I don't mind that you sort of are not maybe my ideal client fit because you're enjoyable to work with. But to your question, right, a lot of DIY people are kind of obsessed with this minimization of cost, maximization of value process, and tend to always want to be able to quantify it or otherwise point to it. And again, that sort of absorption of credit, Schrodinger's asshole problem tends to crop up for a lot of them, where by the end of the first year engagement, it doesn't matter how much you've moved the needle for them. It turns into a "what have you done for me lately" conversation. Doesn't matter if you have paid for yourself for a lifetime based on some recommendations you've made. They will still look at you and say, "Yeah, but what do you got for me now?" And so it just often kind of produces a friction where, for a genuine DIYer who is not actually interested in the relationship or in the opinion or perspective or expertise of the expert, there tends to be a natural reversion to the mean where they just find themselves skeptical of the value, even if the value is ongoing and paid for in perpetuity.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I could see why that could make for a frustrating long-term relationship. Do you have any last chance advice for a DIYer, or things you'd simply say to them is like, "Hey, if this is you and sounds like you, these are words of wisdom."
This is going to come across as sort of, I'll say, almost insulting to a DIYer. So please, understand that this just comes from a good place. Humble yourselves just a little bit, and I don't mean just in finance, but just in life in general. Like, I like to say that I am the world's best patient, which is like, if I go to a doctor and they tell me to do something, I'll do it. If I have a legal question, I always just call my attorney immediately and ask him the question. I don't try to like do the thing where I'm like, well, I'm smart, I can kind of work it out. Like, I had a legal question that I was 100% confident of the answer of last week, and I still called my attorney and talked to him about it, because I was like, look, my confidence could be misplaced here. I'm going to have you confirm this for me. Do yourself a favor and just recognize that you might be a world-class doctor, a world-class entrepreneur, engineer, software developer, music artist, whatever you do. Like, I'm fully confident and capable of believing that you are incredible at what you do. And I'm also very conscientious of the fact that it doesn't really matter how smart you are. There is a universe of things you don't know. And to some extent, right, particularly when the stakes are high, when you're talking about your life savings, your health, the welfare of your family, whatever the kind of the issue is, just be willing to humble yourself a little bit and ask an expert. Respect their opinion. You don't have to agree with it, you don't have to accept it, but get outside of your own head a little bit and acknowledge that everybody has blind spots. And as a DIYer, those blind spots can be tiny and cause marginal, nominal problems, and they can be enormous and cause you incredible heartache down the road.
Funny enough, don't you think that could be said for us, right? Yeah, we work in personal finance, but you know, would we benefit from our own financial planners? Don't we potentially have blind spots we might be missing in our own plans?
I think it's always possible. I think the thing as a financial planner that you really have to kind of keep in context is twofold. One, are you the type of person who follows your own advice? Right? Do you do what you tell clients to do? I think that's the very first thing. I think the second thing is, as a financial planner, do you ever run into a problem that you are not an expert in? Right. So maybe it's not for yourself as a financial planner or as a firm owner or whatever it is for financial planners, but maybe you work at a firm that's doing an equity thing, and you've never really worked with clients on equity things. And so you realize, like, I know the textbook stuff about equity, but I don't live in that world. Should I talk to a planner about equity stuff? Knowing that I could probably do equity planning for somebody else, but recognizing that for myself, I'm just not that comfortable with it, or I'm not used to being in the seat of the person getting the advice on this, and I could probably use it. I'm not quite sold by the argument that all financial planners need a financial planner. This is perhaps an egotistical statement, but I think it differs from the field of law or medicine, where it's like you can't do your own heart surgery. And in law, like there's literally advantages and disadvantages to pro se representation, where literally, like if you represent yourself, you save money, but you lose a bunch of mechanisms and capabilities that attorneys have in court. So then it kind of doesn't help you. I think financial planning is more a thing about blind spots and more a thing about expertise in whether you do or do not need a financial planner, or the habitual behavior component, which is one of the greatest value propositions that we have. If you are the cobbler who, whose children don't wear shoes when it comes to financial planning, then yeah, you probably need a financial planner, even if you are a financial planner.
Yeah, I think in that regard too, just because I'm an expert in financial planning doesn't mean I might not date or marry someone one day who has a completely different viewpoint on me on everything. And I can't really bridge the gap in those conversations, and it's wise to just include a third party in them.
I mean, here's a perfect example. This morning, I was talking to Caitlin, and I mentioned, well, like you can see all our transactions and stuff in eMoney, and she was like, you know what, I have never looked at or wanted to look at eMoney. And so then I was like, well, what if I found you a different, more consumer friendly app? And before I even got to the end of that, she was like, nope, I will never look at it. I don't care. So that's a fair point you bring up, right? Sometimes you marry or you have a partner who has a financial planning need or a type of financial psychology that is very different than yours. And sometimes the help there is not even in hiring a financial planner, it's just in having a more objective third party to help facilitate the conversation between you and your very different partner.
All right, so talking about client psychology and whatnot, then DIY might not be the best fit for us, but let's talk about what is a good fit. Um, you know, First and foremost, Dan, right? Like, let's strip wealth level from the conversation. So, in an ideal world, you have a full client roster, and independent of the level of wealth, what would you say that ideal client looks like?
The ideal client is, in terms like personality, in terms of how they behave and act, they are a high self-efficacy professional business owner, somebody who not necessarily lives for their work, right? Because we have lots of retiree clients, for example, but somebody who has always been a high efficacy, high achiever, who is reaching that point that I sort of hinted at earlier of saying, I am at a stage where I need to maximize my efforts in areas that I am best suited, and I need to defer to experts in other areas to which I am not. So we see a lot of people who are incredible software developers, entrepreneurs, lawyers, business owners, and so on. And they are people who are incredible at what they do. And when they come to us, they're essentially like, look, tell me what I need to know, help me do what I need to do as much of it for me as you can. Like a sort of almost a valet sort of thing. Like, here's the keys to the car, take care of it. That's the sort of personality and type of affect that we tend to work with really well. Somebody for whom money is not the focus, or wealth itself is not the focus, or the planning itself is not the focus, but they really are focused on just what is the value of this thing holistically in terms of both wealth and quality of life.
Yeah, that's a really good way to put it. So, sounds like someone who's just prone to delegation and is willing to delegate this part of their life to somebody else. And I love the analogy of the valet and handing the keys over. Um, would you say they tend to be more analytical? A little bit more feelings based, or is that something you don't really think about?
I don't think about it too much. I'll say from a personal perspective, I enjoy analytical people when they have an intellectual curiosity in the subject matter, not when it is a hands on type of interest in the subject matter. So I'll give you an example. One of our clients was a very successful executive in finance his entire career. He once said, I have to work with a financial planner who's smarter than me. And he said it as a compliment about me to a bunch of other people in this setting. And I got to be honest, to this day, I'm still like, I think he's probably smarter than me, but he's really nice about that. But a person who has absolutely all the capability of managing their own finances, and there's a lot of reasons that he and his spouse made the decision to engage a planner. It had largely to do with taking time back, trying to really not spend all his time on this finance stuff. But then when we have conversations about finance, I know that he knows what he's talking about. Like, I don't have to explain anything in an educational way to this person, but he is still interested in having a conversation, not in a gotcha sort of way, not in I'm pushing you or challenging you sort of way, but a genuine, gracefully playing with ideas sort of way. So I find that very appealing. At the same time, some of my other favorite clients are people who I barely talk to about finances. Like, they come in for their quarterly meetings. We have these really deep conversations about their life, their goals, and their ambitions. And the financial stuff is often just sort of this background noise of, oh yeah, and by the way, increase your contributions to this account, rebalance this account, and we probably need to increase your umbrella by another $1 million. And the finance stuff really exists in this small pocket of otherwise deep conversations about life and what we're accomplishing. I think ultimately, if I have to summarize those things, I like people who are genuinely curious people, right, and who are interested in engaging in the conversation about finance, whatever that means for them individually.
You said something there that I found interesting. It was intellectual curiosity and asking questions because you're genuinely curious and want to know. I tend to find there's two types of lines of questioning that either clients or potential clients go down. It's the I'm curious about this. Could you help explain this to me? But the other is what you also mentioned. It's the almost gotcha. I'm trying to test you sort of line of questioning. Can you just speak to both of those a little bit more and why one is a productive use of time and maybe why the other is just a bad use of time?
The intellectual curiosity thing, I'll give a good example. There's a question I've always wanted to ask in initial consults that I've never added to sort of the conversational script or structure. And it was always sort of a thing that I wanted to include. And then I'll say, got skittish about scaring somebody off by being maybe a little too demanding in an initial consult. What I really always wanted to ask somebody is just like, hey, I bet you're amazing at what you do. Teach me something about what you do, right? Like, you build bridges for a living. Teach me something I don't know about building bridges. Or like, you're a software engineer. Like, teach me the coolest thing you've ever worked. Like, whatever. Like, you don't need to spend an hour like teaching me to code or something, but just like share with me a really interesting thing about what it is that you do, because we have so many clients in so many fields and backgrounds who do really cool, incredible stuff, or had a career doing really cool, incredible stuff. And so it's sort of that mutual curiosity, right? Like, we have a client who has a PhD in physics who worked on the black hole project, photograph project a couple of years ago that made all the news. And so, like, I could pick his brain on, like, astronomy stuff probably forever, as far as just like everything that goes into it. I think it's really cool, really neat. And actually, even recently, there was a picture of like the International Space Station superimposed between like Earth and from Earth towards the sun, and like the station was there, and it was like, how is that? Like, the scale seems wrong. How is it possible? And he just wrote me back this whole explanation of how that worked. Like, I thought that was really cool. And also, many of our clients have those really cool things. That's the sort of the fun of getting just to know people, right? There's an old Nick Murrayism, right? Your clients will become friends, your friends will become clients. And I think that mutual intellectual curiosity complements that. In the challenging thing, it's sort of this thing, and I know our next topic is going to be around trust, so this might segue to it a little bit, but there's this thing that you sort of have to get to with all professional relationships, which is this fundamental trust that this person knows what they're doing, right? So, like, imagine you need to have a triple bypass surgery. You Google it, you go to ChatGPT, you ask it questions, you read articles, a book on triple bypasses. Like, you try as a patient to get as informed about this as you can, because it's a high risk surgery. It could kill you. It's a really, really big deal. And you could go and spend a whole bunch of time with your cardiologist or your heart surgeon, whoever that is, and really like ask them, like, so how are we going to do it this way? And are we going to use stents, or are we going to, are we going to use anything artificial? And, are we doing this arthroscopically or robotically? Or are you going to crack me open? You could ask a million questions about how they're going to do it. And at the end of the day, you're going to have to give them the sole professional discretion to get it done the way that they know best how to do. All your questions, all your curiosities, all your insecurities, everything that goes into that Q&A process is fundamentally about you not trusting or rationalizing a lack of confidence in the thing or the professional, and grilling them for the purpose of feeling better about it. And at the end of the day, no amount of that Q&A is actually going to accomplish that. You have to decide to trust that professional. And so that's where I sort of dislike the challenging gotcha type of stuff, because it's an exercise in trust building. That's the rationalization. But they're not really trying to learn something in most cases. They're trying to get me to say something that gives them either a reason to trust me or distrust me. Um, and the outcome is not necessarily going to be improved by that process. If answering the question helps them understand it such that then they're confident to take the step that makes a positive difference in their life, that's one thing. So I sort of want to differentiate that there's this intellectual curiosity spectrum over here, and there's this really challenging gotcha Q&A over here, and there's a very healthy medium in between of just like, you're saying Roth conversions, Dan. I don't know what that is. Can you explain that to me? Like that's perfectly fine. That's educational. But there's this sort of hostile Q&A thing that can happen on the other end of the spectrum, that I'm not a particularly big fan of, because like, why are we here then? Right? Like, why are you paying hundreds or thousands of dollars to talk to me, if only then to call into question my professional judgment on your behalf? It's sort of this consternating experience where it's one thing if you're just genuinely confused, but the people who engage in it don't tend to be confused people. They tend to be people who are looking for a reason to disagree, or looking for some sort of silver bullet thing that's going to kind of get them past their neuroses and convince them that you're right. And it's just not a very productive or enjoyable experience.
Agreed. I think we both have multiple experiences on various ends of that spectrum. And I think for us, it's pretty easy to gauge which side they're on pretty quickly. We just have enough experience in those conversations. To wrap this up, though, do you think that it's as easy for them to tell they're doing it? Do you think there's some people out there who don't even know they're doing that? And if you were to, in theory, call them out and say, hey, I don't actually think this line of questioning is a productive use of your time and we're not really getting something out of it, that they'd think about it and say, oh, Dan, you might be right. This is an aha moment. Like, you're right.
It seems unlikely. And I say that because they're probably not approaching a conversation where you might say something like that with the openness or the sort of mental state of introspection required for that to come out. Like, it's sort of that thing where sometimes like you're maybe arguing or disagreeing with somebody, and kind of you're going at it and you're going at it, and and finally somebody who's not part of the argument says like you should stop. Like they have been watching or listening, and they say it, and like you have this cognitive dissonance moment when they say that, because you're like, well, hold on, like we were having a conversation or a disagreement or a debate. Like, what do you mean I should stop? Like you're so deep down the rabbit hole that you don't realize that maybe you're being really rude, or maybe you are ignoring what they're saying, or maybe you are just like making a steadily dumber argument the more you iterate through it, where somebody's just looking at you and being like, hey man, like whatever you're saying right now is not making your case, your argument, and like you would be better off if you stopped doing it. And sort of the same thing where like if you just said like, hey dude, what are these questions about? Why are you doing this? What is this accomplishing? You would probably not be the person who, in coming to the conversation with the questions, you are probably not in the mental state to hear that feedback and go like, oh God, what am I doing? Like, why am I doing this? Why? What? This isn't productive. I will also just make an observation, and this is not empirical. This is purely anecdotal to my experience with working with a couple hundred households over the years. Women don't seem to do this. Men seem to do this. I'm sure there's a woman out there who does do this all the time, and there's plenty of men who certainly don't do this. But I don't think I've ever been caught playing the gotcha question game with either a wife or a single woman or a divorcee or widow or anybody like that. But I seem to find a lot of semi egotistical type A men who are sort of domineering in their relationships tend to sort of have this tell me what I want to know kind of approach to these conversations that is not necessarily conducive to them getting the outcome they're trying to obtain.
Yeah, I think that's fair. Um, I've definitely been, and I think most people have, in a conversation where it's like, "Hey, yep, you're not helping your case right now. Tone it down." or whatever the thing is. And it's funny, most of the time you try to justify it, and no, I'm onto something here, but in reality, you're probably not. So, how do I build trust with clients?
I mean, that old expression, right? Build trust by being trustworthy, sort of the basic answer. And I'm curious before we dive into this, because you and I definitely have had a conversation on trust building with clients before. So let's maybe skip past the, like, just how do you build trust conversation here. What prompts this conversation for you? Or, we've been talking about DIYers, been talking about ideal client fit. So why is trust the conversation you want to have this morning?
Yeah. Um, I think, and this is also anecdotal, not empirical, right? There's a subsection of the population that we'll talk to who are, it's not very difficult to get their trust, right? You tell them something and they say, That's great. Let's continue the conversation or whatever the thing is. Let's call that 5%. I'd say there's about 90% that's in the middle. There's varying degrees of time, effort, and energy required to gain the requisite level of trust. I'd say there's also 5% that no matter what you say, let's go to a car dealership. No matter what you tell them about the car, no matter how many perks and deals you try to sway and give them, they're going to make the decision independent of you telling them anything, right? So that's the other 5% on the other end of the spectrum. We know some folks like that. And I want to spend most of my time talking about the 90% who I can have the most impact on, the people in the middle. But it's considerably different depending on their personality and their life experiences. And some people on that 90% are considerably easier to have conversations with. They do the curiosity thing where they ask me a couple questions, I answer them adequately, and that's enough for their buy-in to essentially have the surgery, or metaphorically speaking. But then there's others that I think are also in that 90%, way toward the other end of the spectrum, where it takes considerably more time, effort, and energy, but they're still curious. They're not doing the thing just for the purpose of doing it, and they genuinely just want to know. And that's great. And we gain their trust over time too. I just want to talk about what that takes and why maybe for some folks it takes longer than others, and maybe what's a reasonable expectation for how to build that in a conversation and just a long-term relationship, and maybe rough estimations for like a timeline for how long that reasonably should take, right? So like the heart surgery thing. Is it reasonable to have a conversation with your cardiologist once, 5 times, 10 times? It's still your life. And while we're not doing heart surgery, the work we do is still considerably important to the people we do it for. What is a reasonable expectation?
I think the answer here is asymmetrical, and that's kind of the problem. There's actually a really good study on this. I really wish I remember who did it. I want to say it was out of the University of Texas, but essentially it looked at the problem or the cost of trust, particularly in a financial planning context. And what it essentially highlighted was the less trusting you are, the more expensive the process of financial planning is for you. Not because you end up paying higher fees or something like that, but because the cost of due diligence to build trust comes with its own costs, its own opportunity costs, right? You're spending professional time that could be spent making money. You're spending, time not engaging in planning yet, such that the compounding value is being missed out on, right? As we all know, time value of money, the sooner we do something, the more impactful it will be. And so, in that context, when we think about this process of trust, the biggest thing I can say here is that people should, and this gets into my own doctoral research, people should do lots of due diligence up front. I'm a really big fan of people going to the NAPFA, find an advisor system, and using the resources they have, right? Questions to ask your financial advisor, financial planner. Do you do a fiduciary oath? Will you put out in writing what my fees are going to be and what costs I might incur working for you? Will you disclose or disclaim that you'll receive any third party compensation, revenue sharing, commissions? Asking questions about service model, investment philosophy, communication tempo, like getting as much clarity as you can up front on the scope of service, on the costs. I think that is all very reasonable, very valuable. But at the time that you sit down and say, Daniel, I'm going to hire you as my financial planner, and you have a service agreement in front of you, and you've read the terms and conditions, and you see what it costs, At that point, it behooves you to go ahead and try with whatever willpower you have to turn the dial of trust up to essentially 100%. It doesn't mean to just stick your head in the noose and hope that nobody tightens it on you, right? Like don't be a victim. If you think that something is untoward or weird or you feel like you might be getting scammed, pump the brakes. But the idea that you're going to go ahead and sign the contract and start paying the fees and so on, but not trust the person you're doing it with, is sort of the wrong timing for that. And so that's where I'm happier to see somebody do a lot more due diligence before meeting the planner, after meeting the planner the first time, before signing the agreement, whenever that happens, and so on. But once you get into the relationship, it's okay to keep trying to build trust. But I think everybody benefits the most from acting on a good faith basis, that the planner is doing what they're supposed to, that the planner assumes the client is going to follow through or take their advice as they need to, or that the client is going to ask questions appropriate to effectuating the best outcome for them, right? Again, those educational questions. Hey, you're saying let's do Roth conversions, but what does that mean? But the idea then of this iterative trust, I think you should be building that passively as the relationship matures. But I don't know that it's so much a like, let's do little demonstrations of value until you clear a certain threshold or hurdle. I think it's okay to withhold trust until the time you engage somebody, but then recognize that when you work with a financial planner, particularly on a fee basis or fee only basis, right, they have a fiduciary obligation to you. They have a legal obligation to act with a duty of loyalty and a duty of care to your situation. They have a duty of candor to you, that they're going to tell you the truth and tell you what you need to hear, not necessarily what you want to hear. And so, in that context, then you have to remember that they have far more liability in this relationship than you do, related to being trustworthy and doing the right thing for you. Again, doesn't mean stick your head in the noose and ignore any warning signs, but that's sort of where I come down to here is, once you engage this planner, once you have this professional, it's time to trust them. Doesn't mean you can't remain skeptical, doesn't mean you can't ask questions, doesn't mean that you have to trust them forever. But it's much better and easier to really try to do whatever adequate trust building is required before they're your planner, and recognize that there's an enormous asymmetry here. They are never going to give you an adequate, made up term here, right? But an adequate amount of time to build perfect trust with them before the cost of the time they spend to do that with you exceeds the value to them. From a financial planner's perspective, some planners do a lot of like pre-homework stuff. They have like videos and blogs and things you have to like read and see and go through. I know one planner who has you take essentially a class before you become a client, right, to help you understand them better and build trust in their process and build your understanding in their process and so on. But again, however much time is spent on the front end, when you get to the point that you're going to actually engage that planner, it's time to go ahead and set your concerns aside, or your reservations aside, and work with them on a good faith basis.
I think the upfront research is so important, and I don't think that's something that's independent or just, exclusive to hiring a financial planner. The amount of people and friends I have that take a job because the number they're getting paid looks attractive and then don't actually do a ton of research into the company's values, the average tenure of employees there, speak to people that work at the company and see what they do and don't like about working there. Um, is very useful in the short term because they get the job. It's a pretty bad way to go about their life in the long term because they end up paying for it in their time and energy. It's funny. I think some of the best clients we bring in the last year or so since I've been here, the ones that trust us the most are the ones that the first time we speak to them in person isn't the actual first time they know about us, right? They listen to the podcast, they read the blog, they've seen us out in the community before. And it makes that process so much easier as opposed to the person who goes, I found you on the internet. What can you do for me? What is your service? It's so much more difficult in that context to build trust than with the person who says, oh, yeah, I listened to the podcast you did with Emily last week. It was really great. Which does weird me out a little bit if they feel like they know me a little bit and I'm meeting them for the first time. But that's part of the research that they've done on their end, and it might feel less like research if it's a podcast or an interesting blog, but it is research. They're getting to know us, they're getting to know how we explain and teach certain things, and they're getting to just understand what we do for work every single day. I'd be curious. You said that clients do have a right to remain skeptical within various degrees. Um, what would you say if you had to put a number on it? how much 1 to 100, if we turn the dial all the way to the right, it's 100. That's, our mothers and fathers. They trust us with their lives in finance. Then let's go all the way to 1, someone who, no matter what you say, will never really take your advice. Where should clients land maybe when they hire us on that spectrum? And then maybe what is a reasonable expectation for how much and how gradual that trust building should be from where they start as the relationship matures?
I think by the time you sign an agreement and become a client of a financial planner or really like any professional, I think you have to have trust, and I'll call it either genuine trust or artificial trust. Right? Like there's a practice here where you just say like I don't actually trust this person, but I'm gonna do it. Like I'm just making the decision that I'm going to do it. So whether it's genuine trust or artificial trust, I think you've got to be at least at a 70 on that scale. I think and you have to then be trending towards more trust over time. If you're staying flat or becoming less trustful over time, then that demands a follow-on conversation before we continue in the process. But if you find yourself below the threshold of 50, meaning you trust them less than you do trust them, I think that's problematic because that's going to cause a consistent friction in the advice and in the relationship you have, such that you are going to spend money on this relationship and you might find that you're just not taking any of the advice because you don't trust the source, because you don't trust the efficacy, you don't trust the competence, whatever it is. But I think that's sort of the problem with not having a more than equal degree of trust versus distrust.
All right. I think it's a pretty fair place to leave it. My guess for what you would have said was 80. So I think 70 is probably a good place, but definitely nothing below that. If there's a 50% chance I take this advice or don't, I think that's a really bad place to leave it. And frankly, a really bad way to spend your time and money.
Well, and you say that you would have guessed 80. The reason I don't go to 80 is what I said earlier. I think there is an asymmetrical degree of trust required at the start of the relationship, right? Like I think if I can get you to give me 80% trust after what cumulatively might be an hour to an hour and a half of time with me, like I'm either really, really, really charming, which Daniel, you know me, I'm not that charming, or you are an incredibly trusting person, which is a hard expectation to have on all parts. When I use the artificial trust thing, like I use artificial trust with medical professionals. I know nothing about medicine in any serious sense, and so I look at your credentials and just say I have to assume you know what you're doing. And I could do the whole like educate yourself thing, advocate for yourself thing, but I don't care and I'm not interested. So I just go pretty much to like 95% trust with professionals in that field almost automatically, simply because I know that I know almost nothing, and I'm not going to do myself any favors, generally speaking, by like grilling this doctor about a thing I don't know how to interpret the answers to anyway.
I don't know. I don't love the word artificial in that regard because, in my opinion, it almost makes it feel fake. I feel like I'd be more inclined to use something like blind trust, where it's like I don't know and I'm willing to close my eyes and like fall backward and hope they catch me kind of thing. But that's not artificial. I think artificial almost makes it seem manufactured. I think I'd be more inclined to say something like blind trust or, just because I don't have the knowledge or skill set.
I think we're playing a semantic distinction without a difference sort of conversation there. Right? I could use the same analogy for like a pilot on an airplane. I don't think I've talked to a pilot on an airplane since I was like 6 years old, but I fly several dozen times a year and never once question that this pilot's going to get me from point A to point B. And that is not because I have any individualized trust in them. It is purely this institutional trust in their qualifications and skill sets.
That's fair. Well, I think that's a really great place to leave it. I think that helps kind of contextualize some of the thoughts I've been having around trust.
Easy enough. Well, then that's going to lead us to the great question of the week, as always. Daniel, what have you learned since you were last on the podcast that you think our audience would benefit from hearing about?
I think I'll actually just tie in some of the conversation from today, right? So, like in my personal life, when I moved out to Colorado, I didn't know anybody. And I made a commitment to myself that for a period of time, I would just say yes to everything, right? Like, person I didn't particularly love hanging out with invites me out for drinks. Yes, as long as the time permits, right? Whatever the opportunity or thing was, I figured saying yes was a good use of my time because it would expand the surface area of opportunities and people I meet, and that would be good for me. It was for a month or two. Very quickly, I had no time left, and I never did anything I wanted to do. I was just saying yes to everything, and before I knew it, the weekend was gone, and I'm back at work, and there I am. And I think I can tie that into work as well, right? We can have 10 consults a week with various personalities and people looking for various scopes in a relationship. And if we just say yes to anything they want, right? I want you to manage assets. I don't want you to manage assets. I want to invest in Bitcoin. I don't. Whatever the thing is, if we just say that's fine, that's great. We're happy to help. We're going to have a lot of clients, and we're probably not going to be great fits for a lot of them. And it's going to one make our time and energy and just really stressful. We're going to be working with people who aren't great fits. And at the same time, it's going to take away from working with people and finding the people who actually will benefit from all of our services and really take advantage of what we do. And same in my personal life, right? If I start saying no and am more selective, lo and behold, I'll play more golf and I'll spend time with people I actually enjoy spending time with, as opposed to doing whatever everybody else asks of me. And I think that's just an important thing. It's important to be discerning in who you decide to work with, as much as a potential client should be discerning in doing their research in who they want to engage in a professional relationship.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Yeah, you could have tried.
Well, I want to give you some credit here. The Science of Wealth is produced by My Wealth Planners, a registered investment advisor in Colorado. The theme song is This Is Your Time by Dan Phillips. The podcast is intended for educational purposes only and is not investment advice or any other form of advice. Not all material discussed on the podcast is appropriate for every individual in every circumstance, so you should consult with a certified financial planner, tax professional, or legal professional as appropriate before attempting to apply any of the subjects, strategies, or tactics discussed on the podcast.